Welcome in, Heart Talkers, to another episode of Heart Talk, where we have everyday conversations with everyday people through both the hope and hard seasons of life. And today I am honored to have with me somebody who I just honestly met over socials, Jodie Baulkham. I'm so pleased to have you in today. I think that the universe or the divine, whatever it is we call our higher power, has this way of putting us into paths of other people and other experiences that we need. And I have to say, when I purchased your book, Choosing My Tomorrow, Surviving Murder, Navigating Mental Health, and Harnessing the Power of Choice, I finished this book in 2 days. And as a mother of four and an entrepreneur with a busy schedule, that says something. You had me. So I'm so honored that you're joining me today. So welcome into Heart Talk.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
So, what I'm going to do before we get right into the conversation is I'm going to just read the back of your book to our listeners. And I highly recommend that you hop onto Amazon or onto Jodie's website and purchase the book after the show. And I'll include it in the show notes. But Jodie starts with, what do you do when all your plans for tomorrow come crumbling down? When Jodie Baulkham's world shatters at 29 with the loss of her husband in the line of duty, she finds herself the sole parent of their 8-month-old daughter. In the aftermath of this tragedy, she undergoes a crash course in grief and despair. So that's the beginning of the intro. So let's start with Jodie. Who is Jodie Baulkham?
Mm. In listening to your other podcasts, I knew that this was coming. And I had a conversation with my 17-year-old daughter last night in the car. And I said, Alexis, I'm trying to come up with an answer of who am I without associating any of the roles that I play. Because often when people introduce themselves, they are a wife and they're a mother and they are CEO of a company or they do this in their business. I'm like, but that doesn't say who you are.
Mm.
And so for me, my reflection is like, who am I at the heart of me? I would say that I am a lifelong learner. I am an eternal optimist and joy seeker, a bit of a feminist and empowering women has always been something that I've felt was in me and something that I wanted to convey to the world. I'm a little bit silly, and I would say that I am an old soul in that I like crocheting and curling and all things that are associated with people of the generation above us. So I guess at the heart of it, that is who Jodie is.
Oh, I love that. What stood out for me there was the eternal optimist. That's a
Mm.
powerful combo there. And after reading your story that you so eloquently and vulnerably, if that's a word, wrote, I could see how that came through in your story and how, often when I sit with people either on the podcast here or, in my body talk practice that have gone through the darkest of days, and you talk about hope and optimism and how you find those things, it's so interesting to see how women, because I work predominantly with women, can just pick themselves back up through just the darkest of days and, carry their loved ones back into the light. So let's go right into, this is a podcast about where we talk about how we turn our pain into purpose. So can you share with us a little bit about, how that pain started for you and that ultimately led you to where you are today?
So it started, I had a pretty, I would say, charmed childhood. Like my parents are still together. We didn't go through financial hardships. I was able to get an excellent education. And so for me, I moved through life with relative ease until Chris was murdered. And that's when I found myself just thrown in this reality and this experience. I mean, even at that point, I had lost one grandparent at the time, but I didn't have a lot of experience with grief and loss. So when he was murdered, it was a week after my 29th birthday. I was on maternity leave with Alexis. It was the day that she turned 8 months old. And I found myself um, just at at a juncture and at a pause all at
Mm.
the same time, and trying to rationalize what that looked like. And I would say that I wasn't able to process very much of it very soon. I very quickly went into project manager mode and decision making because of all
Mm.
of the things that needed to happen with respect to the planning of the funeral. In this case, the killer, there was a 6-day manhunt, and so trying to wrestle with the anxiety of not knowing the circumstances around how Chris died, and then after the killer was apprehended, what that journey through the justice system was going to look like. And that was 2 years and continues to take place up until this day. And so all of those unknowns for me were where I found myself living. And so it wasn't just grief for me in the loss of my husband and Alexis's dad, but it was all of the other elements that I found myself trying to navigate as well. And so I would say, in my reflection and putting pen to paper and going through that time, a little, removed from the situation, it wasn't until about 4 months after Chris died that I actually felt my lowest. And
Mm.
I think that's because I had had time at that point to actually process and live with what loss meant. In the early days, it was just shock.
Yeah.
And so, what I hung on to is the fact that I have this little person in my life who is seemingly unaffected by what's happened because she doesn't have the capacity to know the hurt of loss in the same way that we do. And so Alexis learned how to sit and learned how to crawl and learned how to walk and learned how to talk. And so I couldn't um, not attend to those things and not notice those things. So while I was experiencing all of this pain, I also was able to experience the joy and the pride that a mother feels when their child reaches these milestones.
Wow.
And so I really threw my energy into focusing on Alexis and being the best mom that I could for her, and making a commitment to honor the love and the life that Chris and I had, and supporting her growing up in that way. And so she
Wow.
was the anchor point for me to get through.
Wow, as I listened to you speak and as I read your book, I could feel viscerally the two most intense emotions that we can experience as humans that you were going through at that time, grief and joy simultaneously. And you write so, like I said, so beautifully about that. So tell us a little bit about Chris. Who was Chris?
Oh, talk about big spirit. He was his friends call him a beast of a man. He was 6 foot tall, 6 foot 2 feet tall. He was broad. He was a football player and a big athlete. And he was just the largest physical presence that I had ever been close to, but at the same time had the softest heart. And
Mm.
his sense of humor was incredible, and his generosity. He lit up the room. Policing in the North, it's not always, and not that policing anywhere is often challenging, but policing in the North, especially when you've got some cultural differences, he was able to make connections with people that were very different from him. And I
Mm.
think that was his superpower when it comes to diffusing situation with words, and charisma. He had that in spades.
Wow. And so on that day of his murder, it was just an ordinary work day for him.
Actually, he had picked up that shift from another colleague because we were set to go on a 10-day vacation. We were going back to Ontario to pick up a motorhome that we had bought sight unseen that was waiting at my parents' house, and we were going to drive that back north. And that was going to be the way that we were going to take our brood of kids when we had them all and travel around the country. And so he had actually finished his shift, but picked up the night shift from one of his colleagues.
Oh my gosh. So do you ever sit in the what ifs? You
Mm,
know?
very rarely. But that
Mm.
question did come up, but the answer that gave me the most amount of comfort was that if the person that was scheduled that night was working, they actually probably wouldn't have been in the same situation as Chris because they didn't know the community as well, and they didn't know um, to place themselves in harm's way. So I think
Mm,
in my mind, it may not have happened to the other person. It happened to Chris because he was so engaged and so involved and so
mm.
good at his job.
Oh my gosh. The irony in that,
Mhm.
when you sit with that, because he was so vulnerable and because he made those connections. And then I remember reading, your story and your journey through being in the public's eye because it was a very public case. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. And so when an RCMP officer dies, it typically makes national news. So that wasn't the anomaly, but what the anomaly was is the length of time it took to catch the killer, as well as what was happening in the political landscape at the time. That was the weekend of the federal government election.
Mm,
And so there was a lot of coverage, and it was the Harper government conservatives were seeking their second term, and they were successful in meeting that. And so they had wanted a tough on crime legislation as one of their priorities moving forward. And so there was that narrative in the background about how can we use the story in order to leverage the political platform of being tough on crime. And then at the same time, it was a multi-jurisdictional investigation. It involved police officers from the Northwest Territory, Edmonton, Saskatchewan. There was a team in Ottawa. The funeral was in Ottawa, which was Chris's hometown, and that brought a lot of ceremony around it. There were more than 3,500 officers that marched and participated and all of those things. So yeah, I found myself, and I chose to step in front of the camera, still in Hay River. And there's an image where I am standing there. My mom is holding Alexis beside me. My dad is beside her. And I am talking about a trust fund and honoring Chris because people wanted to be very generous. And
mhm.
so kind of addressing the support and thanking folks for the outreach that had already been starting to come at that time.
So did you find it ever overwhelming?
Mm, yes, the most overwhelmed I felt was actually during the visitations
Mm,
because there were so many people coming through, and I felt that I needed to be put together in order to support the people that were coming through the line that I didn't know.
mm,
And so I talk about going into waitress mode, right? Like I was in the service industry, and so you put on your face regardless of how you feel on that day, and you engage with the table, and you're happy and you are pleasant, and you ask how they're doing. And it was just such a strange thing that was happening in that moment because you would expect that those folks would be comforting me, and I found
right.
myself comforting them. And so I did, I put on the brave face for the majority of the time. But when people that were the closest to me came through that line, that's when I allowed myself to have a few moments.
Yeah.
And I talk in one in particular, a high school friend of mine was who introduced Chris and I, and his name is Ed. And Ed and Chris played football together. And so I had known Ed for my childhood. He introduces me to my husband. We maintain that connection. And when I saw him enter the funeral home, that's when
Mm,
he started to break down. I went to him, and then we went to the small family room and just stayed there for the rest of the night. There wasn't a whole lot of time left, but I'm like, no, like this is my people. These are my people. I'm gonna have the moments of being genuine and being vulnerable with people that I care about, and let my family shake hands with the people that I don't know.
wow. And when you write about all of this process in your book, you write in a way where for me, particularly, I could put myself there. I mean, I got emotional several times through your writing. I could see, I could feel, I could, I'm thinking back to what I was doing at 29 years old, and what it might have been like had I, lost a husband and had an 8-month old. So Alexis is 18 now, is she?
Almost 17,
Okay.
yeah.
So how is she her dad? Like what parts of her remind
So
you of Chris?
yes, well, genetically, she got very strong Warden genes. So she has Chris, even though I describe him as bald because he did go bald at the age of 19, I only ever knew him to like Bic shave his head. But photos indicate he was, in fact, a ginger baby. And so he and Alexis both have red hair. They both have hazel eyes, very round face. Her humor reminds me of him every day. She is funny, she is caring. So a lot of the qualities that made me fall in love with Chris, I see in Alexis every
Oh,
day. And as a parent, I love it. I love that she is genuine and I love that she is kind and funny, all of the things that make me smile and make it easier to get through my day.
yeah, and likely make you feel like his presence is still very much there with you both. And so I know you said she was 8 months old when Chris passed. And although babies and children process things differently than us because their capacity to be aware of, what's actually happening and what it means is different because, their prefrontal cortex is just developing, but energetically and emotionally, they can feel, they can sense. So, what did you notice about, you know, Alexis as you navigated that time, just as a baby and into a toddler? Like, how did she process
Mhm.
this all?
Man, I think she actually turned on the charm. I think she realized that people around her needed a little bit of levity and light. And so she started to be, I'm going to say started to be silly, but I mean, she actually had a little bit of a performance that I saw
Mm,
in her, and she would feed off of the energy. Like when she saw laughter, she would ham it up a little bit more. And
mm,
so I think that she took that, and she, she's been part of musical theater and she plays instruments and she performs in that way. And I think that has been something that she could have developed because of
mm-hmm,
that time, because there were people around her regularly. Like from the time that Chris died, we didn't have moments alone in our house. We flew to Ottawa. We didn't have any moments alone there. Like it really wasn't until we returned. And when I talk about that 4 month mark, that's when for a lot of it, it was just her and I,
mm-hmm,
or her, I, and one other relative that had come up to support us at the time. And so just with all of that, the audience, and then Christmas was there, right? Like this happened in October, baby's first Christmas. She was 10 months old. So there was all of that celebration around her. And so that's my perception of the early days. Now, as she became a toddler and it was her and I, there was a little bit more of an attachment because we didn't have another person in our home. And so, got her into play groups and schools and worked on that just so that she was able to be around other kids, and she assimilated very well. But then, in the book, I talk about some of her challenges as she got a little bit older. I talk about her developing obsessive compulsive disorder. And when she was 2 and 3 and she used to line things up, I just thought it was cute. I thought, she knows what smallest to largest is, or she knows,
mm.
those types of things. But that was, underlying root causes.
Wow, that's fascinating when you think about, I mean, and research and studies show that the early impact of trauma in a child's life when they're between ages 0 and 5 can really lay down neural networks for certain patterns and certain experiences.
Mm,
And so, yeah, I mean, even though she's a baby and she can't process really cognitively what's going on, she can feel it and sense it. And she knows people are sad. And if she hams it up, they laugh and
yeah,
she can bring them joy. And so, yeah, I found that part too very fascinating in the book, looking at that journey. And so one of the things too I really enjoyed reading about is what it's like as a widow to restart into a relationship with another human. I have had many conversations with women and men who've been widowed, and it is a very complex, multi-layered process. And you speak so well of it, of what it's like to go through that. So you did eventually remarry.
I did.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about that and what that process was like, finding love again after such great loss.
And so before I get into my relationship with Brent, that process of allowing yourself to get to the point where you're going to invite that in
Mm,
and the complexities and the dynamics around that, what I found, I'm going to say, made it more simple than some of the experiences of other people that I've spoken with, is that very early on, and this could have been my youth at the time and my lack of filter. Like, you know how you get older and you get more mature and you know how to engage with people and you process things and you ask questions in a different way. Well, that filter that I had been developing as a person and a professional had only reached a certain threshold at 29.
mm,
And then with Chris dying, that went out the window. And I was very blunt because I only now had the capacity to do what I felt was right for me and Alexis. And I
mhm.
didn't have the capacity to consider how my actions were going to impact you. I didn't care.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
it's kind of like that give a shit factor for anything outside of me and Alexis was not there.
Mhm,
And that carried into me not comparing my grief or my actions and my choices to that of other people.
mm,
And so I made that choice. It was subconscious at the time, but that's the way that I went through life is I know what's best for me. That may have worked for you, but you are not me and I'm going to do it my way. And so, with the permission to not compare myself to other people and not let them influence my path, that made it easier to give myself permission to move and do what I wanted when I wanted to do it. So, when it came time for me to, and what I have boiled this down to is I let go of the guilt that I was carrying that I wanted a life that looked different from the one Chris and I had planned together.
ah,
And so, as I'm going through, it's about 2 years afterwards, I'm like, okay, I can give myself permission to have different dreams and different hopes. And it's okay for me to do that because the life we led together is no longer an option and a choice for me. And I talk about music and Leona Lewis's song Better in Time. And I used that as an anthem to give myself permission to let go. And
mm,
so it was kind of after that realization, and I released that guilt that my life is looking different, that I started to open myself up to romance.
that's such a
So,
beautiful awareness that I think some people just can't get to, giving
mhm,
themselves
mhm,
permission to just not care about judgment or expectation or
yeah,
the perfect time or what the process should look like. And so for you to be able to do that, in your 30s, we're still just finding
mhm,
out who we are is a gift to yourself as well. So I imagine along with all of this process, there were many tools you had to reach to, and
mhm,
you know therapies, or
yeah.
tell us a little bit about how did you take care of your mental health during that dark time.
So in the early stages after Chris died, one of the RCMP counselors, psychologists, we met regularly, just dealing with the acute feelings of grief and talking about the visibility of myself in that situation because of what had happened. And I found myself very early on being more concerned about the impact on Alexis than about me.
Mm,
And so I engaged a child psychologist as well, explained the situation. And the best advice that I remember receiving that I still employ today is only answer the question that is asked.
mm,
Don't offer any more. Alexis will hear your answer to that specific point. She'll go off and she'll process and she'll come back and she'll add on to it or she'll change it or she'll dig a little deeper, but you've got to wait for it. If you try to put too much on, you're going to confuse them and then maybe stop them from engaging you again. And so I took that to heart. And so that made me feel a little bit more confident in my ability to be a parent.
mhm.
And that's where I found my greatest hurdles were, man, I've only had 8 months to do this with somebody else. And now I've got a lifetime to figure this out on my own. And that was scary.
Yeah.
how am I going to protect this little person? And all of the things that are around it. So it gave me a little bit of confidence and supported my mental health by knowing, okay, if I can hang on to this one tool and use it, then that will help me move forward in just that one part of
Mm-hmm.
my life. Um, Outside of that, I knew the importance of connection and maintaining a social circle and relying on the help of friends and family. I I had a closer inner circle than I allowed the others on the outside to support me. So there were the few that I called on regularly, but I was able to reach out and ask for help from those folks, and I was able to advocate for myself. I was, going back to this filter of I need to have my needs met, and I'm going to tell you how that's going to happen. So I was
Mm-hmm.
able to do that. So those two things were really key in being able to move forward a little bit more confidently.
Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering, as you're supporting this little tiny human, and I would imagine it's when you're paying attention to her needs and helping her through it, you know, it's easy to not take care of one's own needs and to just stuff and store and put stuff on the sidelines
Mhm.
until it comes back and taps you on the shoulder. Did you ever hit a rock bottom of grief of, where it just really hit you? I know you said it was about 4 months after.
Yeah, so that one, and then that one when with 4 months, that was like I was cleaning out my bedside table and I found my medical alert bracelet. So I have a penicillin allergy, but I didn't like vainly, I didn't like the style of the bracelet. And I was like, well, Chris is always going to be around, so I don't need the bracelet because he can just advocate for me on my behalf. And so I found the bracelet. I was like, oh, like I need to put this on now because I don't have that voice.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was the 4 month moment and the reflection of, he's missing so much. I miss him so much. Um, so that was the 4 month. When I moved to Ottawa, and I chose to move to Ottawa because that was Chris's hometown. That's where his family lived. And I thought bringing Alexis closer to them would be healing for all of us. And I needed help. And my parents were still busy. And I grew up on a farm. And I didn't see that same life for Alexis that I had. And so I moved to a city where I knew no one other than his mom and dad and sisters. So in those moments when I'm sitting in this new house that I've bought with life insurance money, and I've got this little person, she was still napping at the time, right? And so I waited for the afternoon nap time to come. So that would just give me a little sense of pause, and a break. And that's when I would read or listen to music or sleep or recharge or have those moments of, okay, this is where find myself in this moment. What can I do next to feel better?
Mm-hmm.
And that's, I think, one of the things I talk about in the book as well is to allow yourself to give you the space that you need to recharge. But also, when you're in those spaces, what are you saying to yourself that's going to promote forward momentum? And for me, that was not focusing on why am I here? It's
Right.
focusing on now that I'm here, what can I do next?
Oh, I love that.
And that was the reframe that I used, that I still use, and that I use with my clients is, okay, what can we do now? What can you do next? What do you want?
Mm-hmm.
And we often don't give ourselves space to ask those questions, let alone answer them.
Yeah, because we're often living in the past or anxious about the future, but that statement makes us be in the now, in the present, and in the
Yeah.
reality of what we're experiencing, not in the, anguish or pain or sorrow of what we wish would be different.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Mhm.
that's powerful. So talk to us about what you do now. What does life look like for you today, as an author and speaker? And I mean, what are you doing with this to, inspire and work and lead and guide others through some of the
Yeah.
same trials?
So I'm encouraging other people to share their stories.
Mm,
There is so much power in someone's story. Other people will resonate with it. They will find hope in it. For me, where this came into full focus, 15 days after the funeral, on my way back up north, I needed to stop in Edmonton to sign a bunch of paperwork. And during that time, it was arranged for me to meet with Kim Gordon. And she was one of the widows of the four members that were shot in Mayerthorpe 2.5 years earlier in
Mm,
March of 2005. At the time, she had a toddler who was 2, and she was pregnant with their second child when her husband died. And so Kim graciously agreed to meet with me. And we're in this large, it was like the meeting hall, the mess of the building. And she walks in, I was already at a table, and she's walking in and she had a large box underneath her arm, and she's carrying it, and she just puts it down, and she said, "You're going to get a lot of cards, and here's somewhere you can put them."
mm,
And then she sat down. I think we did embrace. She sat down, and then she didn't say anything else until I started the conversation. And I was like, just seeing her was like, man, if she's standing in front of me right now, she is 2.5 years ahead of me. I can get there. I can do that too. And so for me, and for others who have these stories to share, I want them to know that just by being present and sharing, you can really influence someone's life in a positive way. Like
mhm,
hope can save a life. And so with this book and with my message on stages, I'm sharing, sure, I have a story to tell. We didn't get into the so much about meeting Brent and forming a relationship with him, but he lives with post-traumatic stress disorder and major depressive disorder as a result of his policing duties. And so
mhm,
I have that angle of being a supportive spouse for 14 years. And so overcoming the grief the way that I did, being that support person for someone who is struggling and continues to have good days and better days. So how can I share that? How can I bottle it up, make it palpable, tangible for people, and then share it and the lessons I've learned along the way? And so that's what I'm trying to do now in my book, and then in my speaking, and then coaching people who find themselves in a great state of transition that
mm.
they didn't expect. And so people who have had their worlds turned upside down, that are living in a new reality that they never thought that they would be in, I coach them through how to make it through this transitional time in their life.
Yeah, and you're so right. Just having one other human being who has experienced even something a little bit similar to what you have, often, like as you talked about the first time that you met that woman, there didn't need to be words because
Mhm.
you knew. And so how incredible it is that you offer that to others now, to help and guide them through their journey and, be that space. So where can we find you? Where can we get your book? Where can we learn more?
So my book is on Amazon. You can follow me on Instagram and LinkedIn and Facebook at Jodie Baulkham. And I have a website that talks about more of my story, some of the speaking engagements I've been a part of, and then coaching services I provide. So that's www.jodiebaulkham.com, spelled JodieBaulkham.com.
Wonderful. And I'm going to link those on the show notes. And I mean, we could sit and talk here for hours, but I want them to buy your book. I want them to read the words in, all the spaces in between some of the stories that you shared with us today. So I want to say that your book was very inspiring to me, and I was able to resonate with, a great transition that happened in my life and some grief that came with it. Because even though, we're walking different journeys, the one thing that we all know well is, love and pain. And so thank you for sharing your story with us today.
No, it's been my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And I know we'll cross paths again.
I hope so.
All right. Thanks so much, Jody.